My name is Dr. Laura Walton-Williams, and I am one of the Associate Deans in the School of Law, Policing and Forensics at Staffordshire University. My Winston Churchill Travelling Fellowship took place in 2017 and focused on sexual offences, and so today I just wanted to present on my findings from that and to start discussions about multi-agency action for change. I should start off with a short warning. Obviously, sexual offences can be incredibly distressing, and therefore if at any stage you need to step away from this recording, then please feel free to do so. So a very brief introduction to me. My background is in forensic biology. So I started off studying genetics and then focused on forensic biological evidence, predominantly DNA, looking at contamination, evidence recovery and interpretation. So my research expertise now centres around sexual offence investigations, and that includes the research into the victim journey, the public's understanding of sexual offences, the forensic examination process, and the interpretation of evidence recovered from sexual offence victims. So in the top photo on this slide, you can see one of my MSci research assistants, Natasha, and she's utilising our specimen capture device, which is a device that we have designed and patented to use as an alternative to speculums, to encourage female victims to come and be examined. The bottom photo is our International Sexual Offences Research Group at Staffordshire University, which I chair, and that's made up of interdisciplinary experts from criminology, policing, law, forensics, as well as community engagement partners, and that's focusing on how we can work together to try and improve sexual offence investigations. And then just on this slide, I've also listed some of my PhD researchers, and you can see some focus there on some key issues in relation to sexual offences, such as consent and underreporting. So I have done my presentation as a bit of a timeline. So I've started off looking at where we were in relation to sexual offences in 2017 before I went on my travelling fellowship, and the factors that influenced that on the run up to 2017. Then I focused on kind of what where I went on my fellowship and what I found out. So I'm going to discuss those in detail, and then a little bit about what happened when I got back, and some of the movements that happened as a result of the research that and the work that was being conducted at that time, and then hopefully some areas that we can discuss in the action learning workshops on what future directions there may be. So, before I went, I identified some key aims of what I was hoping to achieve by conducting this fellowship. So the first thing was to try and identify and understand the variations in the initial stages of sexual offence investigations. And the reason that I was focusing on the initial stages rather than the latter stages in relation to prosecution and kind of the legal aspects are because I felt there was potential, more potential, I suppose, for influence from a positive perspective in that area. So in that, I also looked at access to services, the structure and provision of services, and also interdisciplinary working practices. So I compared and contrasted the practices in the UK to those in Canada and America, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and looked at areas of good and best practice and disseminated those as I went around. And obviously some of those were sharing from the UK to Canada and America and vice versa. So one of the things that I'd like to do in the future is to enable a mechanism to enable continuous sharing of best practice at an international level. And then I aimed to evaluate the potential for success for some of these practices, and then to continue to disseminate these practices and disseminate the findings, which obviously we're leading on to today. So this slide just explains kind of the UK position prior to me conducting my travelling fellowship. So I went in August 2017. So the position in 2017 in relation to cases, I'll talk about in a second, but a little bit of context as to why we potentially saw an increase prior to 2017. And part of that was a result of some historic sexual offence cases and some operations that were implemented to enable investigation of those. So you can see in the graph on the top of the slide, there is kind of a plateau and to some degrees a reduction in reports up until about 2012, and then the increases exponentially. And part of that was a result of Operation U-Tree, which was a result which started in October 2012 as a result of reports of sexual abuse from Jimmy Savile, and then subsequently investigations into Gary Glitter, Max Clifford, Rolf Harris, and many other high-profile individuals. This also kind of coincided with Operation Clover, and this was in 2014 the J report was published, and this focused on offences that happened in the 1980s all the way to 2010s, looking at basically child sex exploitation. And the J report concluded that at least 1,400 children, most of them who were girls aged 11 to 15, had been sexually abused in Rotherham between 1997 and 2013 by a network of British Pakistani men. So again, that had a significant increase on significant influence on reporting. Another operation was Operation Hydrant, which looked into non-recent sexual abuse in football, and that was a little bit later, so in November 2016. And basically, all of those things kind of influenced how sexual offences was reported in the media, and also people's confidence in reporting. I'm not going to go into, so in a minute I'm going to talk about kind of reporting numbers, but I'm not going to go into detail about inclusion or exclusion of reporting. Suffice to say that there was a significant number of offences, and it was a significant problem. There are always going to be changes to figures from an annual reporting perspective based on changing practices in reporting by the police. However, in November 2014, it was recognised in a report that was published by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Service that sexual offences were under-recorded by 26% nationally. And so on the back of that, forces had to obviously change the way that they were recording sexual offences. Now, in 2017, the Crime Survey for England and Wales estimated that 3.1% of women and 0.8% of men experienced sexual assault in the year ending March 2017. And it also identified that 5 out of 6 victims did not report their experiences to the police. Despite that, the police recorded rape actually increased by 15% in that year, and other sexual offences also increased by 14%. So you could see an increase in the number of offences that were actually being reported, even though a huge number are still not being reported. So that's alarming. In the top right hand corner of the slide, there are 2 graphs of yellow and blue bar charts. The one more in the centre of the slide focuses on females, and these are police recorded sexual offences by age on the right hand side, and then the basically the makeup of the population of females are just in general against each age group on the left hand side in yellow. So you can see, and then the next graph along is the same, exactly the same, but for males. So you can see there's a real increase in sexual offences for children. And obviously that was another issue that was kind of very well documented at the time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in 1 second. Another report, also something else that came out of the child sexual the crime statistics of England and crime survey for England and Wales, was looking at the victim offender relationship, and in cases of rape or assault by penetration, and they found that in 45% of cases it was the partner or ex-partner. In 38% of the cases it was another known individual. In 13% it was a stranger, so very low proportion really, and in 5% it was a family member. So again, just trying to set the tone of the issues that we were facing at the time and how some of them are similar today. In May, I was invited to present at the Westminster briefings on confronting sexual violence, and I talked about effective strategies to combating sexual violence. So I talked about evidence-based practices to combating sexual violence, so including education at an individual, community and society level. I also talked about some research that was presented by the Centre for Disease Control in 2016, which looked at a range of different initiatives and programmes to reduce sexual violence, and actually identified that only 3 of them had a significant positive impact. And these are safe dates, shifting boundaries and real consent. And again, we can talk about these a little bit later on in the action workshop if you wish to. I also talked about some of the challenges of interpretational aspects of physical evidence and the need for more research into this. And I also talked about the changes in legislation in relation to victims giving evidence in court, which you can see in the middle of the slide. Later on in that year, in July 2017, I attended a seminar organised by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, which was a Victims and Survivors Experiences seminar. At the time, work was being conducted through 13 separate investigations, some which were case-specific, others were thematic. And the final report for this will actually be published next year in 2021. But some really interesting kind of narratives from the victims and survivors based on that. So that was the position in relation to kind of UK sexual offences. And so I set off on my travelling fellowship in August 2017, started off in Toronto and presented at the International Association of Forensic Sciences conference, networked. And then I spent some time there before travelling across to Newfoundland, which is a very remote area in Canada and has some specific issues. Then moved down to Baltimore, and Washington DC and New York, before moving on to Enola in Pennsylvania, which is a very different environment to the prior places in America, and then returned to Toronto to present at the International Association of Forensic Nurses conference. So obviously you can speak to me about any of those areas if you wish later on. So this is fundamentally kind of some of the key findings. So I've done it for those of you that are old enough to remember blockbusters. I thought this looks quite a little bit like a blockbuster board, but it also indicates the kind of connections between the whole process of sexual offences. So in the middle, we've got the cycle from looking at trying to reduce offender behaviour, but then moving on to trying to improve kind of reporting processes. Then for those victims that require a forensic examination and support, and subsequently evidence recovery, how we can optimise those processes, through to the criminal investigation, and then hopefully through to a prosecution. So on the outside, in the lighter blue colours, I've identified some of the areas that I kind of took some key learnings from. So when I was speaking to somebody from San Diego, they were talking about the normalisation of predation and victim blaming through rape myths. And so one of the pieces of research that we discussed was the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale, and I'll talk about that in a UK context a little bit later. The other thing that we discussed was about 90% of rape victims encountered secondary victimisation. So that was when they were challenged, when they were initially disclosing, through to the police investigation, through to the criminal trial. And also some kind of behavioural acceptance in relation to kind of rape behaviour. So, for example, Bud Light did a advertising campaign called #UpForWhatever, and they advertised it as the perfect beer for removing no from a woman's vocabulary for the night, which obviously is a very unhealthy and concerning media campaign, which obviously went through a number of desks, which is very worrying. From Australia, one of the things that I learned was about the positive and negative influence of technology. So where we have kind of really remote areas where it's difficult to access support, then technology is obviously a real beneficial tool, and obviously we've seen that through the COVID-19 crisis. Some of the more negative aspects, they conducted an attitudes to violence survey, and that suggested that 46% of young people believed that it was acceptable to track their partner by electronic means without their consent. And that's obviously very concerning, because it starts to then move into that kind of coercive control, and then more, which can obviously escalate to intimate partner violence. From Canada and America, actually, very different, but both focused on cultural challenges. So in Canada, it was more in relation to Indigenous communities, and so they identified that it might be really difficult for people to report in specific cultures if the perpetrator was in a position of power, and that actually victims can face alienation and lateral violence if they do report it, which obviously then influences reporting rates and what we can do to reduce sexual offences in those areas. From America, there were some very different challenges. A lot of them focused around racial tension, and again I think we're seeing that in the UK now in relation to provision and support of services for ethnic minorities, and a real lack of understanding of the specialist support required for different groups of individuals. The bottom tile, which you might not be able to see, so I apologise if my face is in the way, is from Florida, and they had a really positive view on the provision and the delivery of their forensic services, and especially from the victim support stance. But one thing it did kind of flag up to me was about how the victim support services worked together. So, and I'll talk about it a little bit later on in relation to case reviews, but really interdisciplinary working. One of the things that it actually identified as something was probably a little bit more positive from our perspective was about the examination guidelines. So obviously in the UK we use the Faculty of Forensic and Legal Medicine guidelines, which are updated every 6 months and based on kind of research. In some areas of America and Canada, they hadn't been updated for years. So obviously that's quite concerning in relation to developments with technology. Another difference related to kind of the location of where people went to get their examinations. So in Canada and America, a lot of the sexual assault nurse examiners are based in hospitals, which was good and bad in some respects. So positive in relation to often from their funding perspective, it's much more constant, but and also in terms of accessibility, but the negative aspect was about a lack of confidentiality, a lack of specialised services in some areas, but also some quite unique issues in relation to if you had a Catholic funding body, then obviously that influenced the contraceptive provision that they had available to them, and also depending on where they were located. Some areas, some police areas had much better experience or knowledge of the same programs where others didn't. In relation to the forensic screening and research, in Canada, it's a government-funded forensic provision, and so their research sits alongside their practitioners, which is really positive. And we learnt about kind of some of their differences in the processes about screening and submitting for DNA. So they have quite a different process, which has resulted in a decrease in turnaround times, an increase in positive results, and a decrease in the cost of analysis. And some of their research has actually indicated that you can identify sperm up to 12 days from an internal sample, and then also looking at external samples, actually after 48 hours you got an increased presence of semen due to drainage. So the bits of research that I also picked up from other areas really identified the need for research to be conducted by experts aligned with practitioners, not either group in their isolation, which I think is something we all agree on. In Canada, they had similar issues in relation to their, what we would, I suppose, call recorded rates. They have they're called as unfounded allegations, and in some areas they had 1 in 3 cases were noted down as an unfounded allegation, which was very concerning, especially as it then influences and skews the data. So it suggests that police get fewer reports of sexual offences, and that actually they have a much higher prosecution or success rate. So a similar issue I think that we have here. In America, I also spoke to a lawyer who was talking about campus sexual offences, and she was talking about the main strategies for rape denial in relation to exaggerated reports or victims are lying, and identified the need for training tools for judges and juries. And again, I think you'll see something like that on the next slide as well. And things like false reports, again, similar numbers in relation to about 2% of reports were found to be false in the US and the UK. And she also highlighted a lack of understanding of victim behaviour post-trauma. We also talked about gender inequality. It's very much deemed to be something that women need to deal with, rather than educating men and getting men involved in that conversation as the major perpetrator. I've put on here some Canada defence whacking. So that basically involved tactics to humiliate the witness, prolonging cross-examination, putting the victim on trial. And then Canada and America case reviews. So one of the things that was really positive from a lot of the places that I went to was about kind of case conferences, where they were reflecting on things that had worked well and hadn't worked well, and looking at it on an individual basis, as well as kind of looking at large kind of statistical reports. So that was a really positive thing. In relation to kind of the post-travel, I came back in October 2017, kind of at the peak of the Harvey Weinstein reports, and they just started the kind of Me Too movement again. Now, Tarana Burke had actually started this campaign over 10 years ago, but it kind of came up as a result of sexual abuse within the film industry, and then it led to the kind of Time's Up campaign as well. And in November 2017, they actually did a poll from Time magazine, and respondents said they were more likely to speak out about harassment as a result of the allegations, and 85% of the respondents said they believed the women making up allegations of the sexual harassment. So, I was kind of cautiously optimistic in February that we were on the precipice of a culture change. Now I don't feel quite the same, but I did a presentation during Sexual Assault and Sexual Violence Awareness Week, which also coincided with Safer Internet Day and Vote 100, with 100 years since some women were able to vote in the UK. I was relatively positive, and then in 2018, in April 2018, the End Violence Against Women International Conference, I attended that, and a lot of the themes continued in relation to rape acceptance, false reporting, campus rape, intimate partner violence, listening to the voice of the victim, and then we started to see a bit of a backlash in relation to the Me Too campaign. So just at the top, you've got one graph that compares Great Britain and the United States. So this was 2002 respondents from the US and UK were talking about how they viewed Me Too, and obviously you can see a difference in the political standing from a US based, but quite concerning that a significant proportion of the Republicans felt that Me Too had a negative impact. And then in October 2018, in Violence Against Women conducted some research for 4,000 people in Britain, which is the graph showing at the top of the slide, and around a third of people in Britain who responded thought that it wasn't actually rape if a woman was pressured into having sex but there was no physical violence. A third of men think that if a woman's flirted on a date, it generally wouldn't be rape, even if she hasn't consented to sex. Almost a quarter of the respondents didn't think that in most cases sex without consent in a long-term relationship is rape, despite the fact obviously the laws against rape in marriage have been in place since 1991. So some quite depressing views there. And then obviously at the year end of September 2019, we've started to see more newspaper headlines about very low reporting rates and very low prosecution rates. So in 2019, only about 4% of all rape cases reported to the police were able to be referred to the CPS, and of those, just over 75% of those made it to court, which was good, but obviously then the prosecution rate could very well be low. So trying to keep positive on an end note. And so these are the things that I'd like to discuss more in relation to what we can do to play a part. So some of that will be things like preventing using gender stereotypes or calling out inappropriate behaviour, looking at how we can educate ourselves and others, how we can engage in a range of different ways. So I've become a trustee for Rape Crisis, and I'll take part in the UN 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. We can also contribute towards consultations. So our university contributed towards the Office for Students Harassment and Sexual Misconduct consultation, and there's currently a Violence Against Women and Girls Call for Evidence, which is seeking views to help inform the development of the government's next Tackling Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. So it's inclusive of anybody that has been a victim, or anybody that works with victims, or those involved in providing services. So we can all kind of contribute towards that. And then I'd really like to talk about kind of how we can work more closely as a partnership in relation to identifying problems and actually identifying what information would be really valuable, and how we can evaluate whether we're actually making a difference. So I will leave on that note, and I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening, and hopefully you found it interesting, and I'm really looking forward to exploring some of these themes with you in the workshop this afternoon. If any of you do want to email me after today, then my email address is on there, and obviously it'll be shared with you. And just a couple of kind of inspiring quotes for things. Just the image there on the left hand side is actually some victim artwork that was presented in one of the locations I went to in America. So as I said, thank you very much, and I'll hopefully speak to you all soon. Thank you.